Good morning, guys. It's Michael, teacher turned trucker. This morning's text is going to be relatively short because I want to handle Peter's first denial and Christ's questioning by Annas separately. Otherwise, I think both or that video would go relatively long. Plus, reading through this morning's, I actually find that there's a little bit more than I had picked up previously. So let me go ahead and read the text, and then I'll come back to and make a couple points that I noticed this morning in my quiet time. Simon Peter, we're in chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter and another disciple followed them as they brought Jesus to Annas. Now the other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, and he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Simon Peter was left outside, standing by the door. So the other disciple, who was acquainted with the high priest, came out and spoke to the slave girl who watched the door, and brought Peter inside. The girl who was a doorkeeper said to Peter, "You're not one of this man's disciples too, are you?" He replied, "I am not." Now the slaves and the guards were standing around a charcoal fire they had made, warming themselves because it was cold. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. The couple things that I noticed, first of all, I'm gonna handle them in reverse order because I think it really strengthens the understanding of the first point when you understand the second point first. I've read and heard this text preached multiple times. Verse 17, you're not one of this man's disciples, too, T-O-O, are you? And for some reason I missed that word. When I have thought of Peter's denial, I always kind of thought of him as just kind of standing alone away from all the other disciples and him just being on his own. That doesn't excuse it. But I think each of us, if we stop at the moment and try and put ourselves in Peter's shoes, if we're isolated from our brothers and sisters, we can begin to see how that might have, in his mind, justified the denial. But that's not the case. Because, well, excuse me, we'll back our way into this one. That word "too" implies that the girl knows that he is accompanying John. She knows John because she let him into the courtyard. She knows John because in verse 15 it says, "Now the other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, and he went in with Peter into the high priest's courtyard." This implies that if he knows the high priest, or is acquainted with him at least, the high priest's servants probably knew him as well. So when John showed up following along Jesus, they let him in. And so this shows a familiarity. So in this, and this is one of the first point I wanted to point out, John was known to be a disciple of Jesus. And he freely and publicly walked in with Jesus, not concerning himself with what potential outcome or collateral damage could result with him following and associating with Jesus. At the same time, you have Peter, who stayed outside until John got them to let him in. So in this situation, John associated himself with Jesus by relationship, and in bringing Peter in, he set Peter as a disciple as well in relationship, most likely is how it would be understood. And this carries through with the question, "You're not one of this man's disciples too, are you?" Well, this shows a character in John who is by and large recognized as being, if not the youngest, one of the youngest of the apostles or the disciples, because he did live to be roughly, I think, 90 some years old is what people speculate, or the year 90 AD. Maybe I'm confusing that number 90 with that. He did live to be the oldest of the disciples, the apostles. So his youth and his association with Jesus is known. He brings Peter in, Peter being a little bit older. I'm not sure off the top of my head how much older. I don't think it's decades, but it's probably a few years at least. But Peter, his heart is shown with his fear. So my question is, as we mull through this, who are we? Are we quick to stand our ground when associated with Christ, or when trials or someone starts belittling Christians, do we follow that path as well? This is something you want to evaluate for yourself, because this is increasingly becoming an issue in our culture. The hostility towards Christians is becoming more and more open. Maybe where you're living, you're not seeing it as much, whereas in other parts of the nation, it's on open display. Christians are openly belittled, persecuted in many respects. Now, is the persecution the same manner as what's happening with the believers in China? I don't think so right now. In China, you can be imprisoned or put to death, whereas here in the United States, the persecution is in the form of silencing. You're not allowed to mention Jesus, mention and talk about the Ten Commandments, apply biblical principles in open connection with your belief as a Christian. Coming out of the education system that I've worked in for the last several years, this was one of those areas that I struggled in this last year or so. I became much more open, and as students would ask questions, if they asked personal questions of me, I had the flexibility and the freedom, and I used it. The first couple of years I taught, I was really, this is to my shame, fearful, because I was afraid of getting fired. So I didn't know what my rights were in that context. But this last year, because I knew that I was transitioning to another career, I became much more bold. And I wish I could say it had happened under different circumstances. And it started to a little bit last year. I just kind of got to that point where I realized I don't have to be ashamed of who my Lord is. And when that mindset is what drives you, it's a lot easier to be open and voice your beliefs. Now, when an issue of morality arose, if someone asked me, I don't know that I've ever backed down from answering that one. It's when it came to the name of Jesus that I found myself not as engaging in bringing the conversation to that point while at work. And this was a contrast for me, because before teaching, I talk about Jesus all the time. It's just something about the fear that I gave into when coming to work in the public school system. I know if I ever return to the school system, this is something that I'm not going to do. I am a child of God, and I'm not ashamed. I'm humbled to be His child, and I want others to know and love Him. So my prayer for you guys would be that you would also be bold. Perhaps that you could learn something from the mistakes I've made or others have made, and not have to go down that route and learn. Don't live with regrets. If you love Jesus and you are his disciple, then engage those conversations where you're at. Share Christ. Be open. Be searching for those opportunities. And then also be mindful with how you live. Is your testimony measuring up to who Christ is? So just some thoughts with the relationship here between John and Peter. The boldness on the one hand, the unapologetic nature. Again, because he went and sought access to the courtyard. John, they know him for who he is. They know that he's a disciple. So just some things to think about. If you have any other comments or things that stood out to you this morning, please go ahead and post them below. If you have any comments, suggestions, be sure and share those. Hit the thumbs up if you got any value. Share the video if you think this would be a benefit to someone else. Maybe someone else is struggling with being bold. Maybe this can be an encouragement to them. I appreciate you guys, and you have a good day. This is Teacher Turn Trucker. Later.